Welcome to the From My Stand podcast with Matt Hinkle. Whether you are an avid hunter, a novice, or someone interested in the sport, Matt has a unique perspective to share. Sit back, relax, and kick your boots up as Matt shares what he's seeing from his stand.
Hi everybody, welcome to part 3 of our series on scouting for whitetail deer. It is March right now and we're a little less than 200 days away from bow season, at least starting here in Ohio. A lot of states will be starting just about 200 days, maybe a little less. And so right now is a perfect time to be out trying to find next year's deer. Get out there, do some scouting, and find you some deer to hunt in the fall. And so that's what this video series is about. This is part 3, and I'm trying to just describe for you or articulate for you what my system of off-season scouting looks like. It is replicable. That's why I'm sharing it. I think that you could take the principles that I'm sharing in these videos and replicate those in your own situation. That's why I'm sharing it with you. So let's just review what we have said up to this point. So I told you that step 1 for me in my scouting is to identify the deer's cover. And cover is where they're going to be bedding, where they're going to be finding their security. The things you're going to be wanting to look for on your property are thickets, high ground, and boundaries. And if you missed any of that, just go back to part 1 of this series. It was 2 weeks ago, and you can watch what we had to say about that. But that's where I start in my scouting, is locating the deer's cover. Number 2, the second thing I'm looking for is their food source. And this will be things like agriculture, places like cornfields and soybean fields. Also nut trees, acorns, and beech trees are really popular around here. Deer feed on those types of nut trees, and so you'll be wanting to find those. Also fruit trees. I don't know if I mentioned this in part 2, the video series. We don't have a lot of fruit trees around where I live, but deer love apples. They love pears. If those things are in your hunting area, you can guarantee that deer are going to be feeding on those. And then just green vegetation, especially late in the season, if the nut trees have all dropped all the nuts and the cornfields are harvested. A lot of times just find some green vegetation on the sunny side of a hill, and if other food sources are scarce, you can mark it down. Deer, they will be feeding on that green lush vegetation. Then the third thing that I try to identify in my scouting is travel routes or trails. Usually these are trails that link the security or bedding areas to the food sources. We talked about in that second video the fact that does and small bucks will use the heavy trails. Mature bucks, which usually is what we're talking about on this podcast, they tend to use the same stuff. They'll use the same cover as the does and smaller bucks, and they will use the same food source, but a lot of times they'll use a different travel route. So if you're hunting mature bucks, you're going to want to look for that subtle trail. It'll be close probably to the main trail, but you're going to want to find that subtle trail because you can about mark it down most of the time. Big mature bucks are going to use the subtle trail. Now, today I'm going to add a fourth thing that you're going to be looking for in your scouting, and that is rut sign. Rut sign. We're just simply going to call it rut sign. And the two things that are most associated with the rut is going to be rubs and scrapes. Okay? Rubs and scrapes. This is rut sign. Now, you'll notice that I put that number 4 in my scouting program. Now, it's not that I don't get really excited when I see a big rub or really excited when I see a big scrape, but I will say that the foundation of every hunting spot that I generally find is based on these 3 things: where their cover is, where their food source is, and where their travel routes are. The rubs and scrapes generally tell me that there is a mature buck. Now, we live in the day of cameras, and I think that that can be a real blessing in identifying the inventory of the deer on the property that you are hunting. But in the old days before cameras, a big rub let you know that a mature buck probably made that rub. A big scrape let you know that there was a buck in the area. The thing about rubs and scrapes, you know, a nut tree or a trail or a bed, that's deer sign. That could have been a doe, that could have been a mature buck, that could have been a young buck. Even tracks, I know some people say you can tell by the tracks. Now, I do pay attention to the width of tracks, the depth that they're pushed into the ground. If you see those dew claws in the back, that's generally a bigger deer. You can tell by the spacing of the tracks, how wide the deer is, how long his stride is. So there's a lot you can tell by tracks. But you know, a rub is unmistakable. When you find and let's just define what we're talking about. A rub is on a tree. You've seen where deer rub their antlers on a tree trunk and they make that scratched out area on a tree trunk. That is a rub. I've heard people say, look at that scrape where a deer scraped his antlers on that tree. On the tree, those are rubs, not scrapes are on the ground where they clear out. They'll clear out a circular area about the size of a trash can lid. They can be bigger than that, but they clear out an area of leaves and get it down to the bare dirt, and that is a scrape. And in the fall, right around the end of October, as you get into November, bucks start rubbing trees and they start scraping the ground. Now, um, here's what I mean by cover, food source, and travel routes are the foundation of my scouting. If I find a nice rub, I do not throw a tree stand up or a blind set up on a rub. Now, sometimes there's rubs around where my tree stands are, or there's rubs around where my blind is. In fact, generally that is the case. But I'm not setting up on that rub. I will sometimes set up on a scrape. If it is a really fresh scrape, and I'll tell you about scrapes and rubs in just a second. But if it's a really fresh scrape, it'll generally be on a travel route, somewhere along a travel route. And I have been known to set up on scrapes, and that can be a pretty good method of setting up a stand location. But let's talk about rubs and scrapes for just a moment. They generally occur in the fall in association with the rut, and the rut is the breeding season of the white-tailed deer. Now, the difference is, and by the way, game biologists have been studying rubs and scrapes for generations, and there's still a lot of mystery surrounding them. When I was a kid and I first got into the sport of deer hunting, everybody thought that rubs were when the deer rubbed the velvet off. They when the deer's antlers are growing in the summer, they're soft and they've got that velvet, and then that velvet comes off in the fall. Everybody thought the purpose of a rub was to rub the velvet off of the antlers. That is generally not believed anymore. It's at least it's not thought to be the main purpose of a deer rub. The general understanding of a deer rub, and this is why I don't set up on them per se. I won't just find a rub and then set my tree stand up over that rub. Rubs are a territory marker for a buck. That's essentially what a rub is. When a buck rubs a tree, he is marking his territory. I've got a couple of dogs. I've got an English chocolate lab and I've got a beagle. And when I take them through a walk in the neighborhood, They pee on every fence post that they come to. They pee on every fire hydrant that we come to. But guess what? Other dogs in the neighborhood do the same thing. And, that dog is just saying, here's my scent, and this is my neighborhood. This is my territory. Well, that's similar to what a buck is doing when he rubs his antlers against a tree. He's saying, this is the scope or the sphere of my territory. And, there could be several different bucks rubbing trees in one area. They're just kind of communicating to one another about each other's presence. That's really what they're doing. Here at our house, we've got a farm fence set up around the perimeter of our home, and I have a fence that goes all the way around. And so, from where I'm sitting, I can look out a window and I can see a northwest post, a northwest fence post, basically the corner of my property, and there's fence post over there. Then over on this side, if I was on the other side of the table, I could look through that same window and I would see a southwest corner fence post. And so what that means is I put a fence post there to mark out the parameter, the sphere, the scope of my territory. Now, just imagine for a minute somebody was hunting me. Now, I hope nobody is. But if somebody were to hunt me, I can just tell you that southwest or even that northwest fence post would not be a real good place to hunt me. Yes, it marks my territory, but I don't ever go over there and hang out. I don't eat over there. I don't sleep over there. I mean, yeah, that post announces kind of the edge of my territory, but I don't really hang out over there. And that's kind of the purpose of a buck rub. They're just kind of telling all the other bucks, hey, this is where I live. But they're not necessarily feeding right by that tree. They're not necessarily bedding right by that tree. And they're not necessarily breeding right next to that tree. And remember, we said in a previous podcast, I think it was last week's on the part 2 of the scouting, there's 3 things that motivate deer. Three things you're going to catch a deer doing when you're hunting: feeding, avoiding pressure, or breeding or trying to breed. And so rubs don't really fulfill that purpose. They just kind of mark out the world of that buck. And so it's good to have rubs in the area that you're hunting, but rubs are not necessarily a place to, I don't ever set a tree stand up on a rub expecting to catch that buck rubbing that tree, because that's just really not how it works. And I've never really found too much success. I've found a lot of success hunting in where rubs are in the vicinity, but not really setting up on a rub, because a deer, they'll freshen that rub up occasionally, but a lot of times that's done at night. And so rubs are good to see, but not necessarily the thing you want to set up on. Now, scrapes are a little bit of a different story. When a buck makes a scrape, it is for the purpose of breeding, and it is for the purpose of communication. If you want to imagine, a scrape is kind of like it's kind of like a phone. It's kind of like a cell phone. It's a means of communication. And when the bucks are at the peak of the rutting season, they're putting in calls to does. I mean, breeding is at the top of mind for those bucks. And so what a scrape is where they clear the leaves away from, and make that bare spot in the ground about the size of a trash can, and then they will pee in that scrape and leave their scent in it. They want a doe to come over, find that scent, find that scrape, and when does are in heat, or even when they're not in heat, they will pee in that same scrape, leave their scent, and it communicates to the bucks where they are in their estrus cycle. It communicates to the bucks where they are as far as going into heat. And so when the buck is ready and the doe is ready, that communication takes place at the scrape. So that can be hot sign to hunt over. I have seen and hunted over scrapes where you could see and even smell the urine. Now you want to be careful not to leave your own scent in the scrape. Don't be getting down in that scrape. But I'm just telling you, in past experience, I have found fresh scrapes where you could see the paw prints in it. You could see where they raked their antlers through it, and you could even see moisture in that scrape where either the buck or the doe. Now I don't have a good enough nose to know which is which, but where they've been urinating in it. When you find a scrape that fresh, you may want to put a stand up, um, downwind of it within bow range or gun range, I guess, if you're gun hunting, because you might get a shot either in that scrape or close to that scrape. So you want to be looking for that. Now, I showed you in last week's episode an example of a scrape that was fresh all year. And those are good things to find too, because again, what is a scrape? A rub is a means of communication, yes, but it's more like a fence post or a mailbox. I mean, it's out there, but it's not used the way a phone is used. The scrape, the best way I can describe it is like a phone. I mean, the deer communicate at that scrape by leaving scent. And so, evidently when it goes beyond the breeding season, they're still communicating at that scrape. And so those are some things that you're going to want to be looking for in your scouting. So here it is. Here's what we're looking for: cover, food source, travel routes, and then, especially in the fall, rut sign. And that would be rubs and scrapes. And, of course, you're going to set up probably in the fall in the vicinity of rubs and scrapes. But I tend to make the foundation of my scouting those travel routes in between cover and feeding. What I want to do before we wrap up this series is we're going to I've got an aerial. Let me get it where you can see it and I can see it. I've got an aerial photograph of a hunting area. Now, this is not anywhere that I have ever hunted, but it is a good picture. I've tried to kind of black out street names and stuff, so because I don't want to put specific hunting spots out on the wide open internet. But this is a pretty far blown up picture of a hunting area. This is all hardwoods and heavy cover. This is a road, and then there's agriculture on the other side. There is a parking spot here, and there's a parking spot here, and these are also roads. So we've got us an aerial photo. I would encourage you, when you're coming up with your game plan, when you're trying to develop your game plan, get a photo, get a map, make a copy of it so you can maybe have an original and then have one that you write on. I write on my maps all the time. A lot of times I'll carry a map with me out into the field, and as I'm seeing things, I'm marking up a map. I've got this little felt paint marker, so it's going to write like in a silver or white color on this. All right, I'm going to do 6 things to this map. Okay, number 1, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark off the prevailing wind direction. That is the first thing I do to my map, because that's going to control a lot of everything else. Okay, so, all right, my marker's not cooperating. Let me see if I can get a little more brightness out of that. I hope you're going to be able to see this. Okay, see what I did there? I marked the prevailing wind. That direction is west. The prevailing wind is going to be coming from that direction. Okay? So most of the time, if I park here, that's going to be good because I can access most of this with the wind in my face. If I park here at this parking spot, I'm going to want to walk down the road and then get on this trail and come in from that way. It would normally be a mistake to park here, get out on this road, and come in with the wind. So the first thing I want to do is mark off the prevailing wind. All right, the second thing I'm going to want to do. Now, I've already covered this. I pointed at it several times. But the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where I can park. Unfortunately, I don't have any hunting spots right now that I can walk to from my house. And so that means I got to drive to the places I hunt, and where I park is going to be pretty important. Now, if I were hunting this spot, I'm not saying I am, but if I was, I would want to figure out where the wind's going to be coming and where I can park. I can park here and I can park down here. This is looking like a little bit better of a spot to park because I can come in against the wind if I'm hunting somewhere, because I'm not going to hunt those ag fields right out in them. I'm going to probably be hunting somewhere in here. And so this is just going to be an ideal way to slip in on them with the wind in my favor. Now, I did scout this place. Okay, I scouted it already, and so we're not out in the field tonight. I'm giving you the results of the scouting, and I'm just going to tell you this: I located the cover, or at least what I think is the cover. Now, I never did hunt this yet, but I did find what I think is their cover. And so let me show you how this works. So on my map, right here, this set what I wrote. If you can't see it, I wrote highest ground or higher ground and thicket. And then right here is just a big thicket and it's cover. So these are the two thickest spots on the whole property in that whole range. But right here is kind of a knob. It's not real high. This is mostly flat farm country, but there is high ground here. It's the highest ground in the area, and it is no doubt where those deer are bedding. I found beds when I was in there. Okay, so number one, wind direction. Number two, where can I park to hunt this? Number three, where's their cover? And that's what I'm looking for when I'm out in the field doing some real life scouting. All right, after cover, what was the next thing we said is their food source. Their food source. Okay, and I'll just tell you that I found some of that. I think the food source is here. It's agriculture. But you'll see that I've got food source right here also. I found a bunch of nut trees there. So they've got a few options. Okay? So this is looking pretty good, right? You got some dense cover and some heavy cover. They can move out of their bedding areas, probably toward the evening, late. But they're going to get food sources here, and then they got all the food they can eat up here in these soybean fields. All right. Next, I'm locating travel routes. And I found some. Usually what I do with travel routes is I just make like an oval. See? That's connecting bedding, and I found trails there. And you just have to take my word for it. We're not out in the woods right now, but there is good trails right there, and there's good trails right there connecting all of this. Okay? So I've got some trails. Now, I'm just going to tell you that I found this also, and I marked it, or I'm marking it right now. Right up here in this corner, I found some heavy rut sign. I found a really big rub and a bunch of smaller rubs. Now, again, I'm not going to set up on the rub, but a buck has kind of marked his territory out there, and so I mark it on my map. I don't want to forget this. Okay? Now, the last thing, so we've basically identified 5 things: prevailing wind, parking, cover, food source, and travel routes. That's 5 things. The last thing that you're going to want to figure out is an approach. Your approach, because it matters. Look, there's 1,000 different ways. Say I set a tree stand up right here. Okay? And by the way, if I set up on this travel route, I wouldn't want to set my stand up here. Why? Because of the wind. If I set it up here, the wind's going to take my scent past all this action. So I'm going to want to set it up there. But if I set a tree stand up there, there's 1,000 different ways I could walk into that stand. But not all of them are going to be good. If I were doing this hunt, what I do is I use a series of dashes to indicate my travel route. Now, this is just one example. You'll take your own map and mark up your own game plan. But here I am, I'm parked. This is a trail. You probably can't see it on the camera, but that's a trail. So I'm going to walk that trail because I can walk it quietly and I can, avoid leaving too much scent. And then notice I'm going to make a beeline, a straight line as I can for my stand. And I'm not going to come this way and circle around in front of the cover because the wind, right? We want to try to keep our scent signature on the downwind side of all the sign, right? So those are the 6 things in developing your strategy. Now, this is just one example. And we, in this podcast and on this channel, we're always going to be talking about scouting. This is part 3, and this is the conclusion of our series on scouting for this portion. But scouting is always important to talk about. But I wanted to show you how you can develop a logical, rational, and successful game plan on the deer that you're hunting. Just a couple of other thoughts, and then we're going to close this down. I always try to find transitions. Deer are edge animals. And so when you're out scouting, and say it's not this obvious, this is really obvious. That's why I use this as an example. It's very obvious. But sometimes it's not quite this cut and dry. Sometimes it's not quite this obvious. And so you might think, well, what do you do when it's not this obvious? Look for edges. Look for transitions. Look where flat ground meets hill country. Look where open hardwoods meets thickets. Look where water meets dry land. Deer are edge animals. And so try to find transitions. Last week when we were out in the field and I showed you that turkey foot trail that we talked about last week, it was right on the edge where open hardwoods meets a dense thicket. That bedding area I showed you up in the snow, that was right before the hill country kind of dropped down into the flat country. And so look for edges, look for transitions. And then also one more little bit of advice, and that is when you scout and find something good to set up on it. If it's hunting season, set up on it right away and start hunting it. I have found that usually my success comes in the first few sits in a new spot. And the more you sit in a spot, the worse it usually gets. So when you scout and you find something good, if it's hunting season, don't drag your feet. Get in there and hunt it right away. Well, I hope this series has been a help to you in your scouting. This is the system that I use and other guys I hunt with use, and we found it to be pretty successful. Take what you've heard in these videos and make it your own, adapt it into your own situation. Not all this is going to work perfectly in every single situation, but the important thing is scout. Somebody said one time, one of my hunting mentors told me that if you spend more time scouting than you do hunting, you'll always get deer. I think there's a lot of truth to that. The relationship between scouting and hunting is kind of like the relationship in athletics between practice and the games. You spend a lot more time practicing than you do playing. Well, you need to spend a lot of time scouting, and if you spend more time scouting than hunting, I think you're going to find that you'll eventually have great success out in the field. I hope this has been a help to you. I'm your host, Matt Hinkle, and that's how I see it from my stand.
Thank you for listening today. Be sure to tell your buddies and follow us on your favorite podcasting platforms. Y'all take care.